Of ability.
Yes, you do. Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. My name's Jess. I am the community manager here at Pear Tree, and I am so excited that we have Torie DiMartile joining us tonight. If you are in the adoption space, you've probably seen her on social media as Wreckage and Wonder. She is an incredible educator and a transracial adoptee, and I'm just really excited that she's going to be sharing with us tonight. So I will hand it over to you, Torie.
Awesome. Okay, let's see if I can share my screen with you all. It looks like you need to enable sharing, Jess.
There you go.
Okay, let's see if that works now. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone for your patience. You would think that after almost 4 years, what I guess it's been since the pandemic and all of our experience we have utilizing online platforms, that you would have no glitches whatsoever in doing our various Zoom activities. But nonetheless, the difficulties persist. I just want to say thank you to Jess, first and foremost, for inviting me to speak. I am always very excited when I see agencies and adoption professionals prioritizing pre and post placement education. And I also want to thank you all for being present. It is not taken lightly. You take the time and the energy out of your busy schedules to be present and to learn. And that is the biggest endorsement, I believe, for the type of parenting that you will do with your potential child. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. This presentation is called Understanding Your Adoption Motivations. So I want to start off by just giving you a sense of what we'll cover throughout this workshop. So first off, we're going to have some honest, challenging, but also encouraging discussions. I think it's really important that we utilize workshop settings to practice the type of skills you're going to need when you parent. And that includes honesty, that includes humility when dealing with topics that are uncomfortable or sensitive. And it also includes having opportunities to leave encouraged and ready with practical tools to implement in your parenting journey. So we'll talk a little bit about adoption education and the idea that adoption is lifelong and the education is lifelong, before we jump into the main topic of this workshop, which is exploring several common approaches to and beliefs about adoption, and in particular, their impact. What kinds of consequences do the beliefs we hold about adoption and transracial adoption have on our parenting styles? We'll also identify some preconceived notions that have shaped your motivations to adopt. We are constantly inundated with information through news sources, through social media, through movies and entertainment that are communicating to us about adoption. We may not be immediately aware, but we're always absorbing various ideas about who is fit to adopt, what a good parent looks like, why birth parents or expectant parents may choose to place their children, what it looks like to be in a transracial adoptive family. We see images and narratives pretty much day in and day out. How is that affecting us? What kinds of ideas are those images and narratives kind of planting in our minds that may be shaping our choices? We'll also discuss appropriate and open-minded alternatives to some of these approaches that could be harmful. And then last but not least, I want to touch on how we go about talking to friends and family. Once we have education, our next job is to educate our community. So how can we do that in a way that is assertive, but also respectful? So we'll get to this slide in just a moment, but as I mentioned, I want to talk briefly about adoption education. I want to start by encouraging you to make adoption education a lifelong choice. You are in a wonderful position at the moment where your adoption agency and the professionals that you work with are primarily responsible for giving you relevant education. So you are pretty much just receiving what they have to offer. They're making the plans, they're scheduling the education. In many cases, it's paid for through the fees that you've already provided to the agency and to adoption professionals. So you're really in a good position at the moment. But what happens later? Right? What happens when you finalize the adoption, you bring baby home? What about then? Then you're going to be primarily responsible for making the effort to plan and schedule and attend workshops and continuing education. So really, a lot of folks may initially think to themselves, I have a newborn, I have a baby, we finalized this adoption. Does the newborn really need anything more than food and love and sleep? We don't really need continued education because they're so young. We'll just do it later on, and we'll sign up for additional courses and workshops when they're older or when adoption or race begin to be an issue. And this is the first, and I believe the most common and critical mistake that adoptive parents make post-placement. It's vital, it's absolutely vital to take a proactive rather than a reactive approach to education. Rather than wait until your child has the capacity for understanding or brings a problem or a question to you, prepare now, so that in the future, you can confidently support your child as they learn and as they develop their racial identity and their adoptive identity. So if you think about this outside the context of adoption, we don't wait until our child sticks their hand in a fire before we talk to them about the fact that fire is dangerous and fire can harm you, and what are the proper ways to enforce fire safety. We don't wait until our child runs out into the middle of the street to chase a soccer ball and get hit by a car before we tell them that cars drive on the road, cars are bigger than you, cars can hit you. So let's try to stop, look both ways, make sure there's no cars coming, and to ensure that you're safe, right? So we need to start applying that mindset to our adoption education rather than waiting until there's an issue or a concern or a question that's raised. Take the time now, especially if you're waiting. If you're in the waiting phase, which can be long and arduous and tiring and difficult, take that time that you're waiting to invest in continued education, to develop the skills that are necessary for a healthy and connected adoptive parent and child relationship. So, a couple ways that you can start doing that in advance. Number one, begin considering how you're going to talk about adoption to your child. Don't wait until you have a child in your arms to decide how you're going to share their story with them and with friends and family. Take time now to discuss with a friend or your spouse, how are we going to respond to questions that our child asks about their birth parents? How are we going to respond to questions that our friends and family have about our child's adoption story? What kinds of boundaries do we plan to set in terms of privacy and ensuring that our child's story is honored and is not accessible to everyone who happens to be curious, right? If your friends or family have negative or harmful ideas, how are we going to address that? How are we going to respond, right? So take some time now to role play certain scenarios and do so with a friend or a spouse so that you have practice responding to difficult questions. You have practice telling the child their adoption story. And then also, especially if you're adopting transracially, it's really important to begin developing racial literacy. What is racial literacy? Racial literacy is the vocabulary that is necessary to engage in meaningful and critical conversations about race and ethnicity. Talking about power, talking about white privilege, talking about race. What is race? What is racism? If you don't know the answers to those questions, you're probably not going to be able to explain it to your child, right? So take the time now to begin investing in that kind of education. Because believe it or not, children pick up on racial differences and implications very early on. There is significant research that has been done through the American Psychological Association and through a couple other organizations that show that by 3 months of age, infants have a preference for a person whose race matches their own. Infants begin to show differential associations based on race. And by 6 months, infants are generally able to associate same race faces with happiness and comfort and safety, and faces of a different race with lack of comfort, fear, anxiety. So at even such a fundamental and malleable age, children are beginning to absorb information about their environment. And by the time they're in kindergarten, they're often already exposed to a diversity of children and adults. They're already interacting with people of a different racial and ethnic background. So typically adults feel like maybe 5 years old is a good time to start talking to children, but really it's advised to start talking to children about race by the age of 2. So adults tend to avoid and maybe ignore or skip over race conversations because they feel like a child is too young. It's actually the opposite. They are more capable than we give them credit for. And they're already developing ideas associated to race and ethnicity. And unless we intervene and begin to shape those, they're going to begin drawing from their environment, which may not be giving them accurate information. So building that racial literacy and understanding early so that you are prepared to begin talking about skin color and racial and ethnic differences and culture as a child is from an infant to a toddler to a kindergartner is really important. It's important that that process is seamless, that there's not a moment in time where you sit them down at 5 years old and say, so there's this thing called race, and this is what skin color is, and this is why people are sometimes treated differently. So take that time to develop that toolbox, that arsenal of language and vocabulary, so that you're in a positive position to begin engaging your child, right? You don't want to wait until your child comes home from the playground and says, oh, I was called the N-word. And then realize, oh, dang it, we haven't read any books on race. We don't know how to define race. We don't know how to tell our child why it's important. We don't know how to help them identify when something is racist or not racist. So that's, again, where the proactive rather than the reactive approach becomes important. It's also important that during this waiting phase, you begin to self-reflect and analyze some of your own beliefs about adoption and race. Find a friend, do so with your spouse, and answer some questions aloud together. Am I afraid to have an open adoption, and why? What are some of my biggest insecurities around adoption? Is our child's birth parents' struggles with mental illness or drug addiction going to impact the way I talk about them to my child? How am I going to ensure that I maintain a mindset of openness and kindness and respect? What are some implicit unconscious beliefs that I have about birth parents or race or ethnicity? So these are questions that you can begin asking yourself, even in this early phase, to help you discern where additional education is needed. And that leads me to this slide in particular. Why is it important for you to start analyzing your own ideas about adoption and race? Why is that even necessary? A lot of times, adoptive parents, in particular transracial adoptive parents, will take the approach that they can cross off this long list of to-dos that will get them to a place of anti-racism. If we go to the right school, if we find the right hair salon, if we go to the right church, if we do the right actions, then we will be parenting in an ethical and race-conscious way. And that's not actually how it works. Our motivations and our beliefs structure our actions and our behavior. So what you believe about adoption and the reasons that motivate you to pursue adoption are going to directly impact your parenting. So if you value Black leadership, then you're going to enroll your child in a diverse school. So the conviction comes first, and then the action. So realistically, it looks like this. Here's the mindset. Here are the questions I ask myself. Here are the values I begin cultivating. And then out of that conviction, out of that belief system, my actions will follow. So many times I see prospective adoptive parents wanting to get it right, wanting to achieve a specific set of action steps, but they haven't done the necessary work to evaluate their internal mindset. They haven't done the necessary work to become convicted about how they need to approach people of a different race or ethnicity. You have to be convicted first in order to have your actions line up with your belief system. So I see parents scrambling a lot, wanting to do all the right things, and that's out of a genuine desire to parent well. But I often think if you just lived out a personal belief system of valuing people of a different race or ethnicity in a different culture, then you will more naturally know the actions, the things to do that will help and benefit your child because you're already living it as a lifestyle. So that is an aspect that I think is largely missing from adoption education. You can't act yourself into a value system that generally results in you just doing things because you know intellectually it's the right thing to do and not because you personally believe it. So take some of this time to ask those hard questions and sit in that discomfort and evaluate where does my thinking need to change? And I encourage people to do that in community, with friends, with family, with a spouse, for the sake of accountability. And I encourage them to practice sitting in that discomfort because that discomfort is going to be continuous. If you're adopting transracially, you're going to experience discomfort. You're going to have people ask silly and hurtful questions in public. You're going to have your child ask questions that you don't know the answers to. You're going to have to navigate potentially open adoption or explain why you have a closed adoption. These are all instances where you're going to need to sit in and get comfortable with discomfort. So I always advise that you're doing this kind of internal assessment work, both with others, but also in a practice-oriented fashion. So let's move on to some of our beliefs about adoption. We've already mentioned, where are we getting these ideas? We're getting them from all different areas. Mentioned news, we see lots of human interest stories that talk about adopted individuals, that talk about foster care, that talk about adoptive parents. Literature is a huge area that we gather information and knowledge about adoption. Social media, I'm sure many of us are aware of different social media influencers who are involved in adoption and help shape what larger society thinks adoption is. And then also movies, entertainment. Some of our most beloved characters are adoptees. You have most of our superheroes come from a broken family or a displaced family, and we see them rise into their identity and their heroism. So we have a lot of access to adoption images and narratives, and we need to be really critical about what we're absorbing and how those images and narratives are structuring what we believe. So I want to put into practice that discomfort. I want to ask you to engage a little bit, get outside of your comfort zone. You can either do so by speaking, or if you want to type in the chat, that's great as well. I'd love to start with the image on the left side, the blind side. Many of us are aware of this story. This was a huge hit when it was released. You have Michael Orr, who is a young man with a dysfunctional family. He doesn't have a place to stay. And the Tories are a wealthy white family. that are entrenched in the local football community. They bring him in and they kind of help launch him into his sports career. And then on the right-hand side, we have a book that some of you may be aware of, some of you may not. This is called Kisses from Katie. It's very prominent in many evangelical circles. A lot of folks may have read this or heard of it. A young teen from Tennessee who, after high school, moved to Africa and began some humanitarian work with children there, and ended up adopting 14 of those children as a young adult before she was even 21 years old. So when we see these images and we hear these stories, what are some word associations that we may have? Feel free to just drop it in the chat. What are some things we think of? What are some beliefs that may be coming from these images and these stories? White savior, right? White saviorism. Yeah, right? It's the white perspective. We have the Tuohys and we have Katie, who are the protagonists of the story. They are the ones that are shaping the narrative. They're the ones that are receiving significant praise and accolades for their act of supposed charity, right? Yeah, beautiful stories, right? These stories show difficulty and pain and trauma, but they largely end with kind of a neatly tied bow that may be a little misleading about the dynamics and the complexity and the nuance of adoption. Of course, adoption can be beautiful, and in many times it is, but it often is not final in that way. It has ups and downs. Especially adopted individuals perceive and experience their adoption in different ways. Sometimes they feel grateful, sometimes they may feel sad, sometimes confused, sometimes angry. So having stories that have a neat and kind of linear plot line, and they end with a pretty one-dimensional feel-good wrap-up, what kinds of consequences does that have for the way we approach adoption or the beliefs we have about adoption? It's limiting, right? If you have either end of the spectrum, if something's really, really good or really, really bad, those are polar opposites. It doesn't really allow for complexity and nuance, how something is experienced in the middle, right? All right, here's a couple others. We have Little Fires Everywhere, which is a TV show that was adapted from a book. And in the book, there is a plot line of a young Asian American woman who is placing her daughter for adoption into a wealthy white family. And in this story, the birth mother ends up kidnapping her child after the child is placed. She's experiencing significant grief and loss and trauma, and she breaks into the house of the adoptive parents and she steals the child. Then you have Juno in the middle. I'm sure many of us are familiar with Juno, teenage pregnancy. She places the child, and the end of the movie, she's kind of riding her bike off into the distance, and kind of a happy, fairly one-dimensional ending. And then on the far right, Orphan, you have this story of kind of a dysfunctional, maladjusted child who is pathologically kind of damaged and has this baggage and ends up inflicting violence on her adoptive family. right? So we have lots of different ideas here. We have ideas about birth parents being risky and dangerous and unpredictable, and ideas about birth parents reclaiming children after an adoption is finalized. In Juneau, there is not a lot of engagement with the aftermath of adoption, right? We see her pregnant, we see the infant, and then the story ends. Is that typically where the story ends? No, that's where the story is just beginning. And then orphan, kind of perpetuating ideas about adoptees being broken, deficient, having, you know, severe problems that might verge on the pathological, right? So these are just a few of the narratives that we're generally exposed to through the media, and we're absorbing various adoption narratives all the time. However, some of them are harmful to adopted people and to birth parents. So it's crucial that we are critical of what we're viewing and what we're ingesting when it comes to adoption and transracial adoption. So some questions to ask when we're kind of faced with this information about adoption. What ideas or beliefs are embodied in this representation? Who benefits from this representation? Are harmful or inaccurate stereotypes being perpetuated? And then lastly, whose story or experience is being left out? And is somebody's story or experience being told for them? Are they the ones with the mic and the agency and the ability to tell their own story? Or is it being told by someone else? So we'll talk about two common adoption beliefs or motivations. The first one is this idea that we don't see color. We'll adopt any child, a child of any race, we don't really care. And many of us have heard someone say this phrase, and we may even have said this phrase, and that's okay. We're all in a continuous learning journey. And while this is a really nice sentiment, this idea that, oh, we don't see color, it doesn't matter to us, it's simply not true, right? We see race every day. We see race when we're on the bus. We see race when we're watching Netflix. We see race when we're deciding who to sit next to eat, or what places in town to frequent. This is just factually not true, that we don't process racial and ethnic differences. So what is color blindness? I think it's important that we recognize how this is defined. It's defined actually as a form of racism in which white people minimize or deny the extent of racial inequality and discrimination, or try to explain racial inequality as resulting from factors unrelated to race, right? So it's important to ask ourselves, if race doesn't matter, then why does racial inequality persist? If race is something that doesn't impact life trajectories or opportunities, why are there continuing forms of disparity? Through the colorblind mentality, the only other option is that it's the fault of the community of color that is experiencing this inequality. That's the only other option. If it's not racism, then it's the deficiency of that group of people, their inability, their lack of intellect, and that is racism. So that's why colorblindness is called a form of racism. And it often involves just evading color and race, denying racial differences, really emphasizing this idea that, oh, we're all the same on the inside. And then it also is a form of denial. It oftentimes denies racism by emphasizing equal opportunity. Oh, if you just work hard, then you'll be able to achieve. Everybody has equal opportunity, right? So it's important to understand why color blindness can be harmful, specifically to children. If parents are unable to recognize that racism isn't just something that happens interpersonally, it's something that happens at a societal level. And if they're unable to understand racism, then they can't teach their children how to identify racism and cope with it. It also causes children to question their own reality and experiences. If they're having parents that are saying, oh, race doesn't matter, or that person was just having a bad day, they didn't mean that, or are you sure that's how you experienced it? It really causes children to second guess their own experiences and their reality. And if they get the sense that parents are evading or avoiding race, then that tells them that parents are not going to be a safe space to talk to about experiences of race and racism. That also leads to potential distrust between parents and children. If my parents are not going to see my experience as real, if they're going to dismiss it as being dramatic or question that it happened, then why would I tell them about it in the first place? And as a researcher that studies the impacts of color blindness on adult transracial adoptees, I can tell you that color blindness is by far the number one reason adult adopted individuals become estranged from their parents. It's the number one reason that they pursue informal or legal annulment of their adoption, because they feel as though their experience of the world is not seen, is not validated, and therefore they don't feel like their parents are a safe and trusted space for them to confide in. I'm going to skip this example, but if later during the Q&A, there's additional questions about how to respond to racism and racist events that a child might share with you in a color conscious way rather than a color blind way, we can return to that example and discuss it in a little bit more depth. So another common adoption belief or motivation is the idea that adoption was God's plan. And I want to emphasize here that having a religious background, being spiritual, being a person of faith is not a problem. That experience is often central for people who are adopting. It helps them go through what's often a very long and difficult process. It is a meaningful way that they experience life. So this is by no means advocating that you dismiss your personal beliefs. Instead, it's an encouragement to evaluate how language that you use about faith and God's role in adoption can impact a child. So when we say things like God, like adoption was God's plan, we're really erasing a lot of an adopted child's history. God designed families to be together and to stay together. When a child is not raised in a biological family, that means the biological family has experienced crisis. There's some kind of problem that has arisen that's preventing that family from staying healthy and together and connected. So when we're saying adoption was God's plan, we need to think about what that conveys to our child about their biological family. What does it convey to a child about the reason behind their pain and their family separation? So that kind of language of God's plan implies that a child's first family needed to dissolve or become broken in order to fulfill the desires of another family. That God chose to break up this family in order to build another family. So that is going to create some confusion in a child. What about my first family wasn't good enough to stay together? Why couldn't it be God's plan for my first family to stay together rather than for my first family to be broken apart? This can also serve as a form of spiritual bypassing, an overemphasis on fate or destiny of the adoption oftentimes doesn't leave a lot of space for questions or sadness or pain. So if the narrative is constantly reiterated that adoption is God's plan, it's really hard for a child to express any difficult emotions. How do you say, well, God's plan is a little bit sad, or God's plan feels painful? It's hard for a child to say that when their experience has been put up on this pedestal. So what are some alternatives? God can still play a major and meaningful role in an adoption story, and faith and religion often does. But I think it's important that the focus is on God's love for all of a child's family, adoptive and biological, to reinforce the fact that no family is better than another family or more deserving of parenting. It's important to speak honestly and factually with your child. Tell them why their biological family was unable to parent. Obviously, do so in an age-appropriate way. Reinforce that there are differences in experience, sometimes because of opportunity or life situations, difficulty, lack of resources, lack of social advantages. One family isn't able to care for a child. And that's sad and painful and traumatic. But this family is able to care for that child, and that is beautiful and loving and joyful. Those things can coexist, and that allows for them to coexist for the child without kind of broad brushing their life and their experience as something that was solely good and solely meaningful for this one family while it was painful for another. So I want to take a little bit of time to just kind of self-reflect. What is your motivation to adopt? There's lots of motivations, right? You may have experienced the incredibly painful journey of infertility. You may be deciding to grow your family as an older couple. Does faith or religion play a role in your motivation to adopt? What adoption beliefs and approaches do you identify with? Has there been a time where maybe you abided by a colorblind mentality? Or you used language around faith and adoption that may not have left a lot of space for a nuanced and complex experience? What beliefs do you need to spend time evaluating and challenging? So after you're doing this kind of self-assessment, you're also going to need to address these larger ideas of adoption and race with your friends and family. So it's really important, number one, to have patience for their journey. You are up close and personal into adoption, and you are constantly educated and reading and have this very raw experience. Your friends and family may not. It may take a significant amount of time for them to develop awareness, to prioritize education, to learn what is, positive adoption language, to learn how to be respectful and honoring of a child's birth family or birth culture. One way to help facilitate that is to offer resources for their continued education. It's a phenomenal idea to get your family together and to pay an adoption educator to come in and provide education for your family. Make it an event, cater food, bring your community together, offer them a chance to learn alongside you. Also, share openly and early about your values and beliefs related to race, ethnicity, adoption, and birth parents. One way I suggest that can be really helpful is by using announcement cards. So many times we all know someone has a baby, they send us a card, you have a beautiful picture of the child, maybe a family photo, and it's the announcement of this new addition to their family. Do that. Have that be a chance for you to share a photo of your new family on one side, and on the back, write a little note. And it can be standardized. Every announcement card can have the same written information on the back, where you share a little bit about what adoption means to your family, how you're excited that your village is going to come together to help you raise this child in a way that honors their racial and ethnic identity, in a way that respects their birth culture and their birth parents. Subtly include some of these beliefs and these values that you expect your community to abide by in order to create a supportive environment for your child. It's a way to simultaneously affirm their role in your life and your desire to have them involved, while also setting expectations. This is the language that we use when we talk about adoption and birth parents. This is the language we use when we talk about race and ethnicity. That way they have a bit of guidance, and you serve as a role model for how you would like them to approach these complex issues with you and your family. Also, decide ahead of time what is off limits for discussion, and practice, like I mentioned at the beginning, responding. It's very hard in the moment to respond tactfully, respectfully, and assertively when somebody says something offhand or inappropriate, whether it's a friend, a family, or even just somebody in a store. So it's really important for you to practice responses that you feel comfortable using frequently to let people know that part of our child's story is personal and we're not going to share that. Being able to practice letting others know what is off limits for discussion allows you to do so in a confident and assertive way. And it allows you to confidently take initiative to hold your community accountable if they kind of violate that boundary. How do you respond? What is going to be the next steps? Up until the time a child is old enough to begin verbalizing their own adoption story and advocating for themselves, you're responsible for doing that. You're responsible for protecting their story, for ensuring that their racial and ethnic identity is respected and valued, for making sure that their birth parents are not demonized or vilified. That's your responsibility. And one of the great things is by enacting these values and beliefs you are modeling to your child. This is what we believe is and is not okay. And them seeing you advocate for them reinforces their value. So I want to end with just a few affirmations. I think it's really important when we're learning and we're ingesting new knowledge and we're evaluating some of our own beliefs that we leave space for compassion for ourselves. We are all learning. We're all at different stages. And we're going to be at different stages throughout our life course. None of us have ever achieved a moment of expertise. So it's important to remind yourself that this is a process, that you do not need to perfect it overnight. That's why I reinforce the necessity of being proactive and starting early and not waiting until baby comes home or baby's a toddler or baby starts noticing differences in how other families are formed to begin discussing adoption and race. So it's important to have the ability to challenge ourselves, but also offer ourselves some grace. So these affirmations, the first one, having preconceived notions about adoption and race that are negative or inaccurate do not make me a bad person. When I know better, I do better. I have the power and ability to continue my adoption and race education. That's a choice that you can make. I can and will be a lifelong learner that prioritizes my child's well-being. The adoption and the transracial adoption journey is really hard. It is not easy. And that's why I always advocate for difficult and uncomfortable conversations at the educational phase of adoption so that you begin to have practice and exposure to discomfort. But that doesn't mean that it can't be a meaningful and beautiful experience for you and your child, but you are responsible for cultivating that. And neglecting educational opportunities will have a long-term effect on the health of your child and the connectedness of your parent-child relationship. And because that process is hard and unpredictable and messy, it's really important to have some affirmations that you can ground yourself with, to come back to. Being an adoptive parent, being a transracial adoptive parent, there's a lot of insecurities, a lot of questions, a lot of space for you to get defensive and prideful and feel bad or guilty. And sometimes those emotions can be so big that they prevent us from focusing on our child and funneling our energy into developing the skills and knowledge we need to be a good parent to our child. So that's why I think it's really important that when you start second guessing, when you start self-deprecating, when you start having questions, that you have a set of affirmations that you can return to help you recharge and recenter so that you can reposition your energy and your focus on your child. So that's why I like to end with some affirmations. So that's kind of the entirety of what I wanted to share with you all. I'm shocked that it is only 8 o'clock and I somehow landed at the right time so that we can prioritize some Q&A. I'm happy to talk about anything from the presentation, especially if you wanted to return to some examples of how to respond to racism in the moment with your child. We can do that. Can answer other questions related to the presentation, but I'm also an open book and I am not easily offended. And I'm happy to share anything about my personal journey of adoption or any other questions that may be unrelated to the presentation. So thank you so much. And I will turn it back over to Jess for Q&A.
Torie, thank you so much. That was incredible. If any of you have any questions, feel free to either drop them in the chat or unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask.
Oh, fantastic question. What books or materials do you recommend? So is there a specific topic that you are thinking about? Books or materials for general adoption or transracial adoption?
I would say transracial adoption.
Okay, yeah. So there are many. I have a kind of pre-collated list that I send out after each presentation that I will give Jess that she can distribute to all of you. My number one recommendation is to listen to adult adoptees. But also to recognize that adult adoptees are at various phases of their journey. So you may experience adoptees that rightfully so and are justified to very strong negative opinions about adoption. And while I think it's important that you expose yourself to those, I also think it's important that you take them in small doses, that you kind of don't drink from the fire hydrant. So the list that I provide kind of is a gear up list that gives you some foundational recommendations for podcasts, documentaries, and books that you can then build on to kind of get deeper into your learning. So I'll make sure that you have those.
And I have everyone's email address that RSVP'd. So once Torie sends that to me, I will send out the recording of this session as well as her additional resources.
And I'll also, in that list, I'll include age-appropriate books for children that talk about race, culture, ethnicity, skin color. So if that's something that you would like to look into, those will be on the list. As far as like podcasts that I recommend, I really recommend April Dinwoody's podcast. I believe it's called June and April. I would also recommend the Honestly Adoption podcast. And Angela Tucker has a podcast called The Adoptee Next Door that I would also look into. And then there was one more. Lori Holden has a podcast called Adoption, the Long View. She's an adoptive parent. She's not a transracial adoptive parent, but I really respect her. And I think she does a phenomenal job providing insight to adoptive parents that she wished she had when she was going through the process. And I find a lot of her episodes really helpful. Do you feel there's a difference on how an adoptive family versus a single parent of a different race speaks to a child? That's a great question, Lori. I don't think there's a significant difference. I think the only difference is that when you're a couple, you have to be on the same page about your own ideas. So for instance, I adore both of my parents, but they are not on the same page regarding what they believe about race. And that makes educating your child very difficult. Especially when one parent is more race conscious and actively pursuing an anti-racist lifestyle and the other parent is not. I think that is probably the biggest difference when it comes to addressing race as a single parent versus two parents or a couple. I actually think in that way, there is some increased control and agency over how you talk about adoption and race because it's coming from one person. I think as a single parent, the only like a change or additional recommendation would be to really lean on your friends and your family when it comes to practicing the types of dialogue that you're going to have, gaining their insight. When you're going through this process as a unit, as a couple, you have like a built-in person that you can process and navigate with. I think it's really important as a single parent that you prioritize community and that you prioritize someone with whom you have a strong relationship and you trust that can kind of be a go-to support as you're going through the adoption process, which can be very difficult and very long. But also someone that as you begin engaging adoption issues as your child ages, somebody that's going to be there to be a sounding board. I think those are the only two differences.
I'll just unmute myself and ask because I can't type as
Oh,
fast
okay.
as I wanted to. Do you have any recommendations on how adopting families who are open to adopting transracially can have those discussions with their family members that might potentially not be as welcoming? I mean, I lived in the South for 10 years and worked in adoption and saw that pretty commonly a family was open to it, but they had, you know, grandparents or aunts and uncles that were a little less open in their worldview.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing I recommend is when you adopt an infant and they become a toddler, they're going to go to grandma and grandpa's house, right? They're going to go to auntie and uncle's house. There might be sleepovers, there might be play dates. Begin with your friends and family at the level you begin with your child. So I often recommend if you're sending little Johnny to Meemaw and Peepaw's house for the weekend, put those books in there. Put the books that you have chosen as a family that help you explain race and skin color and difference and culture and diversity to your child that you read to your child before bedtime, send them to Meemaw and People's house, right? If they know these books and they like these books and they're accustomed to reading them, it's going to be really hard for Meemaw and People to say, we're not going to read that book. So it allows them to begin engaging in these concepts in a bit of an organic way and a bit of a subtle way. So that's how I would begin. I think it's also really important that you are vulnerable with your family. If you model vulnerability by saying, gosh, I had this idea about Black people or Latinx people that I realized was kind of wrong. And I felt really guilty about it. They begin to recognize that it's okay to have these beliefs but it's not okay to keep them, right? It's like, okay, we recognize that everyone might be exposed to these and everyone might have these. And if you are willing to share your learning journey with them in terms of how uncomfortable you are, the fact that maybe you feel a little defensive or prideful or guilty, it gives them some permission to feel the same way and to let their guard down. Now, granted, we all have family members that they're just not going to let their guard down. They're not going to be emotional. They're not going to think critically about their own beliefs. And I think it's really crucial that you distinguish between the people for whom there's a crack in the door and for whom the door is completely closed, because you're going to get really tired really fast trying to convert the stalwart racists in your family. You need to find the people that there's a possibility they could be open and begin exposing them and engaging with them rather than focusing all your energy on trying to change someone who's just never going to change. And in that instance, that's where you need to start setting boundaries, where you say, you know, hey, we have paid for this educational webinar for our entire family. It's 3 hours on a Saturday. We've paid for it. We pay for food. We will even pay for childcare. And if you decide not to come and be invested in learning for the sake of our child, then we're going to have to set some boundaries. And that means maybe limited time. Like, we hang out in group settings, but we're not going to send little Johnny to Mima and people's house alone for the weekend. Right? So identify the difference between those two people, prioritize your energy so you're not exhausted, provide opportunities where you can lovingly, you know, don't make an ultimatum, but say, you know, we want you in our lives. You are important to us. We value you. We want you as part of our village, but in order to be part of our village, we need you to come alongside us in our beliefs and our approach to adoption and race. So give them opportunities to do that. And if they repeatedly resist, that's when you need to start setting boundaries.
I love it. That's great advice. Thank you.
Any other questions? I love questions. How do your parents... That's a great question. How do your parents view the work you do in educating on this topic in adoption? I'm hoping you have a book. What does that mean? Hoping you have a book. That
Lori wants you to write a book.
I
you
want
want me
to
to write a book.
I want to read your story. I loved Angela Tucker's book, and I'm like so curious, but don't want to be like appropriate here. So anyway,
Okay, I see.
but I'm
Thank
very
you for that. Okay, so first off, my parents and I's journey through my own education has been very difficult. They are in their 70s, and they really had not considered the fact that adoption could be a long-term traumatic event. That, you know, you were raised in a loving family, you really had most of the opportunities you could ever want. While you may have questions and maybe some occasional sadness or desires to seek out biological family, this isn't going to significantly impact her life. And I think when they found that out, it was very difficult for them, because they had a certain experience of adoption and I had a certain experience of adoption, and they were not the same. And for a while, my parents had a hard time reading my posts or my blogs because it made them feel guilty. And they felt like I was airing our dirty laundry. The tipping point came in 2020 with the national racial reckoning and the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And my parents took two different approaches. My mom decided to buckle up and get busy. She started listening to podcasts, reading books. She switched churches to go to a Black church. My mother cannot drive across bridges. My dad would not take her. So she found people that would take her to the Black church. She built relationships with people of color, friendships. She began being mentored by the Black pastor there. She started attending anti-racism conferences. And that enabled an entirely new level of respect and connection in our relationship. I no longer was responsible for educating her, and I was seeing her value me through her value of people of color that were not me. My dad chose the other option, which was, I'm going to proudly and repeatedly vote for Donald Trump, regardless of how you feel about it and how you feel that that may be impacting you, questioning my experiences of racism, just really digging in his heels. I would say that he's come a long way, and he is not where he could be. And that's why my relationship with my mom is the strongest. There were really hard moments where my mom and I were working day and night, going to counseling, talking 3 hours a day on the phone to try to understand each other. And there were moments where we would say to each other, I just don't think we're going to make it. I don't think we're going to get to the other side of this. This is too painful. And it is single-handedly my proudest moment thus far in my short life that we made it to the other side. And the only reason we did that is because my mom chose to be brave instead of scared. My mom chose to lean in and radically prioritize me. So that looked like when she would say things like, do you wish we hadn't adopted you? And I would say, Mom, who does that question serve? What answer is going to be an answer that you want to hear, right? That question doesn't serve me. That question is her trying to suss out whether or not I feel like they made a mistake and if I'm happy with them as my parents. So basically that's her asking me to validate her, and that is not my job. And I told her that. And that was very hard for both of us. But that was a turning point where immediately she realized my need to be prioritized as a mom and to be loved as a mom and to be told that I did the right thing and that I didn't mess her up is my problem, not hers. And that has been the pathway to us remaining close and developing an even more meaningful relationship than we had previously, which was already very connected. So I love that question because it's so meaningful to me what my mom and I have been able to achieve. And I know it's achievable for every adoptive parent, regardless of when they decided to start their anti-racist journey. She started when she was 73. So that's why I'm so adamant that you start now. Because I'm like, I had to get through some serious bitterness towards my mom for waiting that long to understand me as a person. And I don't want any other adopted individual or adoptive parent to have to undergo that kind of heartbreak and heartache. So that's kind of the reason behind the work I do. And yes, I would love to write a book. We'll see about that. I'll let you know when my dissertation comes out first.
You are like so wise beyond your years. I actually want to know how old you are too, if that's inappropriate or not. But like, I'm so amazed by you. You're incredible. Thank you for sharing such personal stuff. I appreciate it.
Oh, that's so kind of you, Lori. Thank you for such an insightful question. I'm 30. I'm gonna turn 31 soon. So there's that. I have been finding wrinkles. Any other questions? I think we maybe have 5 more minutes.
Do you have any like kind of mainstream movies or TV shows that you think that have done adoption well?
I think probably the only one that I think has come close is This Is Us. And I know that they did have a transracial adoptee consultant. Unfortunately, I do think it's important to state that she passed by suicide, and that was after some pretty significant personal adoption related difficulties. But she was a prominent part of that process. And I think there were a couple other individuals. I don't know if Angela Tucker was involved at some level, but I know from the get-go that that was a very ethical and wise position to take with the show, seeking the advice and the insight of someone with a lived experience. So that's why I even give the show the time of day. I think they do a really good job of showing the way that Randall, the Black transracial adoptee in that situation as an adult, was experiencing reanimated trauma. So you see his biological father come back into his life, and he has some moments where he's acting very irrationally. And I see that as a pretty accurate depiction of how adoptees navigate these new, deep ruptures in their life, reunion or realizing that they were adopted and they were never told. There's a huge pendulum swing of emotions, and sometimes that can manifest as being really irrational. So I thought that was really like an insightful detail to attend to. They also featured, I think, Rebecca, the mother. She kept Randall from his biological father, and they showed some of the guilt and the insecurity that she had and why she did that. I thought that was really great. So I think probably This Is Us is the closest. I think they also touch on race with siblings. So I think his siblings were like, we never knew this was a problem. And he was like, well, you never asked. So there are some pretty spot on moments in that show. So I think I would probably say that one. But overall, I just don't think that they're there.
I agree.
Yeah, I wish they were.
I know. Any other questions with our last couple of minutes?
Can I just add, I think the movie Lion did a pretty good job of showing the adoption story from the perspective of an adoptee and why, it's important for adoptees. So, you get a better understanding of why they seek out information on their birth families. I don't know how many of you saw that movie, but I bawled. I mean, that movie really got me. As an adoption professional. Yeah, I loved that one.
Good to know. Thank you, Anne, for that recommendation. I have heard of it through the grapevine, but I've not watched it myself. So I will have to do that.
Yes. Yeah, it's good.
Well, that's good to hear. Yay.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, Torie, thank you so much for sharing your education and your wisdom and insight with us. I know even still, I take away things from every time that I get to hear you speak. So thank you so much. We're so grateful to have you with us tonight.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate you all being here, and listening and asking great questions. So
All right, well, thank you guys so much again. I will send out the resources that Torie mentioned after I get them from her.